Welcome. My name is Catherine Furlong. I work in Library and IT at Bucknell University, and presenting with me today are David Consiglio from Bryn Mawr College and Craig Milberg from Willamette University. Dave is the principal investigator of the MISO survey, and Craig and I are both associate directors on the all-volunteer MISO survey team. We are here on behalf of the entire team to present the initial results of a study looking at academic library and IT services through a DEI lens. We're so pleased to present as part of the AIR Forum and hope that this recording will entice you to come and talk about these results in person in Phoenix. This is the first time the MISO survey team is presenting at AIR, so this is an important step for us. And if you have questions about our methodology or analysis, we hope we can engage with you face to face. The study we're discussing today addresses four main research questions. Are students of color more or less satisfied with technology and library services? Do students of color find technology and library services more or less important to them? Do faculty of color find technology and library services more or less important to them? And are faculty of color more or less satisfied with technology and library services? But before we begin, we need to talk a little bit about the data and where it comes from and what's included in it. For today's analysis, we'll be using data collected from the MISO survey. The MISO survey is an assessment of library and IT services established in 2005. To date, roughly 180 different colleges and universities have participated in the survey, and it's fully customizable to fit any sort of administrative structure for your library and IT organizations. It's an identified survey, and the data is released to participating institutions in many formats, including SPSS. The types of institutions that have participated range across the board, from Ivies to large state institutions to community colleges. But roughly 50% of the schools that have participated have been from the liberal arts sector. Since it was established in 2005, nearly 400,000 responses have been collected from faculty, students, and staff. Each of those different populations have slightly different surveys that are administered to them. For today's analysis, we will be focusing just on the faculty and student surveys. The survey itself covers a wide range of services in library and IT areas. As you will see in a minute, there are many different services that will be included in this analysis. We should mention that the survey gets strong response rates. Typically speaking, student response rates range between 40 and 50%. The faculty response rates range between 50 and 60%. Staff response rates are similar to faculty, but we're not using staff results in today's study. So let's talk a little bit about data definitions. This is a presentation clearly about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how students and faculty of color view library and technology services in higher education. So we need to define what we're working with today. For this research, we're only going to be using data collected since 2014, with a particular focus on the data we've collected since 2019. By limiting the populations and the timeline, we end up with 170,000 faculty and student responses from 154 different colleges and universities, which is the overwhelming majority of the schools that have ever participated in the MISO survey. I've mentioned previously that the student, faculty, and staff surveys are slightly different because they are customized for each of the populations. In the student survey, there are 66 different technology and library services that are evaluated. In the faculty survey, there are a possible 90 different technology and library services that are evaluated. And what we're going to be doing is looking at those particular library and technology services. It's also important to understand what we mean by a student or faculty member of color. There are many ways that we could be defining a person of color for the purposes of our analysis. We are identifying a survey respondent to be a person of color if they self-identify as anything other than white and white alone in the demographic part of the survey. For example, if a respondent self-identifies as white and Asian, they would be classified as a person of color for this analysis. In a similar fashion, if a respondent self-identifies as white and Latino, they would also be classified as a person of color for this study. But if a respondent defines themselves or identifies themselves as being white and no other racial or ethnic identity, then they would be considered not a person of color. While we recognize that there are many ways that you can define a person of color, I will emphasize that it's important to understand that we have evaluated this data across many different definitions of person of color, and the results remain robust across all the different ways that we have looked at the data. So if we look at our study approach, as I mentioned before, there are 66 student services and 90 faculty services. We'll be looking at this from a big picture. We're not going to spend time evaluating any individual service. What we will do here is test each of the services for differences based on racial and ethnic identity, and then we'll count them up. For example, how many services are more important to students of color? How many services are less important, and how many services have no difference? This approach allows us to look for bigger patterns that span across services. It's also important to understand what we're not going to show. The data we will share will reveal the who, what, where, and when as relates to racial and ethnic identity and responses to these services in the survey. But we're not going to be able to tell you why the patterns emerge because we don't know why yet, and we're not going to say how we should react. The why and the how are those parts of the conversation that we need to engage with as a community. And so to dive into the data, I'm passing this off to my colleague, Dave Consiglio.
Thank you, Catherine. The first research question that we want to explore today is, are students of color more or less satisfied with technology and library services? We believe this is a critical question. We are here to serve our students. If the services we are providing are being received in different ways based on racial and ethnic identity, then we may have a problem on our hands. So we found this to be one of the most critical questions that we could ask of our data. Okay, let's explain a little bit what you're seeing here. These are the results of service satisfaction differences for students between 2019 and 2022. As Catherine mentioned, for each of the 66 service areas that we evaluated, we tested for statistically significant differences based on racial and ethnic identity. After evaluating each of the services for statistically significant differences based on racial and ethnic identity, we counted up the number of services where students of color are more satisfied with their services. And you can see it on the chart here in blue. The services that are more satisfactory to students of color are identified in blue. If students of color are less satisfied, it shows up on the chart as orange. And the services where there is no difference based on racial and ethnic identity show up on the chart as gray. So you can see from this pie chart here, the overwhelming majority of services, there are no differences in satisfaction with those services based on racial and ethnic identity. In the minority of services where there are statistically significant differences based on racial and ethnic identity, most of those services are more satisfactory to students of color than less satisfactory to students of color. However, the big point here is that there really are not that many differences based on racial and ethnic identity. In fact, if we look at the effect sizes for the services where there is statistically significant differences, we can see that the average effect size across those services is very small. Those effect sizes, on average, come in at less than 0.1. So even where we do have services that are less or more satisfactory to students of color, the size of those differences is so small that it renders those differences, for all practical purposes, meaningless. So that leads us to our first big takeaway in the data. One is that there are no major differences, no meaningful differences in satisfaction with library and IT services based on racial and ethnic identity. Now let's look at our next research question. Do students of color find technology and library services more or less important to them? Similar to the last chart, in areas where students of color find the services to be more important to them, it's indicated on the pie chart in blue. Less important to them would be in orange, and no difference is in gray. It should be pretty obvious from this chart that this is our first big wow of investigating the data. The overwhelming majority of services are more important to students of color than to their white peers. And there are no services that are less important to them. And if we look at the effect sizes, while the effect sizes are still on the small side, it's also considerably larger than what we were seeing with the satisfaction numbers. So the first big takeaway is that students of color find our technology and library services to be more important to them than they are to their white peers. We wanted to explore this a little further, see if we can investigate as to why this is the case or how persistent it is. So the first way we decided to explore this was to look at it over time. And on this slide, we can see, if you look at the slide for 2019 and 2022, compared to the same results from 2014 and 2018, that while there are some small differences here, the major takeaway is still there. Students of color find our technology and library services to be more important to them than their white peers do. And this is persistent over time. Next, we decided to look at this as the library services versus technology services. And here we see a similar story. Whether we're looking at technology services or we're looking at library services, students of color find our services to be more important to them than to their white peers. So even though in that first slide that we showed you, the effect sizes were not especially large, these results are starting to become more robust because they persist over time and they're persisting across service type. Next, we decided to look at it across institution type. As mentioned previously, roughly half the schools that have participated in the MISO survey are at liberal arts institutions. So perhaps what we're seeing here is we're capturing a higher education sector effect rather than a general effect. And here we can see that it doesn't matter whether it's a liberal arts institution or not a liberal arts institution. The effect remains, the finding remains. This is becoming more robust. It spans across time, it spans across service type, and now we see it spans across institution type. Next, we decided we want to take a look at class year. So perhaps it has something to do with where you are as a student in your life cycle as a student. So we broke up the data into first years and sophomores and compared that to juniors and seniors. And what we see here is that it's almost identical. This finding is incredibly robust at this point. It spans time, it spans service type, it spans institution type, and it spans the career life of the students. We weren't sure what to make of this. We first did this analysis in 2021. We decided that we would like to understand a little bit more of the why around this. So we went in pursuit of a why. We consulted with several DEI professionals. We do not pretend to be professionals in this area. We wanted to reach out to those people who have a better understanding of this than we do. And during the course of those conversations, the most commonly cited possible explanation for these findings were related to socioeconomic background. Well, you have to understand, the MISO survey is not a sociological study. We're measuring essentially library and technology satisfaction with our services. We didn't feel we were in a position to ask an entire suite of socioeconomic variables, questions for the survey. The more we explored how we could get at this type of information without dramatically altering the nature of the survey, the more we came back to the idea of adding a question that measures whether the student is a first-generation student or not. It is far from a perfect question. However, based upon the consultation we had with experts in the area, we felt like it was a fairly good proxy for a socioeconomic background. And here are the results. So we introduced that question, first generation, into 2022 survey for the first time. So the data you're seeing here is the result from just the most recent data that we collected. And what you might notice is that the pattern stays the same even when we are looking at just first generation students. In fact, the effect size is a little bit larger than what we were seeing previously. So this really brings us to the point now where we can't explain away these racial and ethnic differences just based on them being a product of socioeconomic background. Because even when we control for a proxy for socioeconomic background, these patterns persist. So let me recap what we've seen so far related to the student data. When we're looking at service satisfaction, there are no meaningful differences based on racial and ethnic identity. However, when we look at service importance, technology and library services are more important to students of color. And no matter how we try to explain that away, the findings persist. They persist over time. They persist across service areas. They persist across institution type. They persist across stages of students' careers. And they even persist within first-generation students. With that in mind, we now want to look at faculty results. And with that, I will turn it over to Craig Milberg.
This leads us to the next question. Will we see the same pattern related to service and importance when we look at the faculty data? Will faculty of color tend to find technology and library services to be more or less important to them? Using all the same methodologies as for the student portion of the study, here are the results. Yes, the pattern continues to exist among the faculty as well as we look at this graph. The overwhelming majority of library and IT services are more important to faculty of color than they are to their white colleagues. In fact, the numbers are almost identical to the student numbers, and the effect sizes are nearly identical as well. The proportion of services that are more important to faculty of color is almost exactly the same as the proportion of services that are more important to students of color. We wanted to see how robust this finding is across the different ways that we can examine it. Here's what we found: that for faculty of color, technology and library services are of higher importance, and this persists across service areas, over time, across institution type, across age groups and genders, and across academic disciplines. In fact, every way that we could think of trying to potentially explain away these findings did not work. The findings are persistent even though the effect sizes are not overwhelmingly large. To put a cap on it, these findings are remarkably robust. This leads to our next research question. Are faculty of color more or less satisfied with technology and library services? As a reminder, what we found among students is that there are no differences in satisfaction with library or technology services based on racial and ethnic identity. Will this pattern hold true for faculty as well? Here are the results, and they caused us to pause, because for the first time, we've seen quite a bit of orange in our graph. You can see that for roughly 30% of the services, faculty of color are less satisfied. Again, let me pause on that fact. For about a third of services, faculty of color are less satisfied than their white counterparts. This is completely different than what we saw for the student data. And even though the effect sizes are small, and they are quite small, they're also bigger than what we were seeing with the student data. Remember, the effect size among students was closer to 0.1, and this one's approaching 0.2. Small, but larger than what we saw with students. So we wanted to start breaking this data down, much like we did with the student data. The first thing we did was look at library versus technology services, and this was the second big wow of our analysis. Because what you see in this graph is that when we look at technology services, there are no meaningful differences with service satisfaction based on racial and ethnic identity. However, the overwhelming majority of library services are less satisfactory to faculty of color than they are to their white colleagues. To repeat, the overwhelming majority of library services are less satisfactory to faculty of color than to their white colleagues. Something that is important to point out is this doesn't mean that faculty of color are dissatisfied with library services. Library services in general have very high satisfaction numbers. So if you look at faculty of color responses to library services, you would see that overall they are very satisfied with those services, but they're not as satisfied as their white colleagues. So we wanted to dig deeper, as we have done with the research questions. We wanted to see if there's a way to explain this away. Well, we could not explain it away every way we looked at this. Faculty are very satisfied with library services overall. Racial and ethnic differences in satisfaction are small. Faculty of color have lower satisfaction with library services. These findings persist over time, across institution type, across age groups and genders, and across academic disciplines. So the faculty takeaways: faculty of color find technology and library services to be of higher importance. Faculty of color are somewhat less satisfied with library services, and these findings persist across a wide range of potentially confounding factors. Let's recap the whole study for a moment. For student importance, services are more important to students of color. For student satisfaction, no difference in service satisfaction based on racial or ethnic identity is identified. Looking on the faculty side, faculty importance, services are more important to faculty of color, while for faculty satisfaction, faculty of color are less satisfied with library services. So what's next? At the beginning of this, we told you we were going to look at who, what, when, and where, and we've done that, but we also told you that we are not going to tell you why this is happening. We are not going to tell you how you should react to this. In fact, this is part of the conversation that we would like you to engage in. This needs to be a community conversation. At this point, we don't have answers to the why, and we don't have, and we won't pretend to tell you how you should treat this data. But we do need to have the conversation about it, because even though these effect sizes are small in areas that we found, the robustness of the research results tell us that these are meaningful. We need to digest these things and decide how it's best to react to them. For those of you attending the AIR conference, we hope you'll engage with us at the live presentation, and thank you for your attention.